Hey guys, welcome to the first edition of A Brief History of Jazz. In the course of this video, make sure that you have a pen and a paper of some kind, or just anything to write on really, and make sure to write down key points that I mentioned throughout the video. After the video is done, there's going to be a short quiz on blend in the quiz section that will go over the topics in the video. So make sure you write things down. The important things are going to be on the PowerPoint that's in the video, the main things that are on the quiz, but especially for those of you that might want to continue music later on in your lives, whether you want to do band in college or some kind of music in college, or you want to play in a non-scholarly band, like just a rock band or a pop band or hip hop or whatever. This kind of information will help to inform your music and will help you to be better musicians and just better all around people in general. So let's go.
The roots of jazz are old and very, very cultural. It originated in New Orleans in the late 19th, early 20th century, so the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was primarily in the red light district, which was all the bars and brothels of the day. These were not places that people wanted to go to if they wanted, nice areas. This was where a lot of the poorer people came, a lot of immigrants, former slaves, things like that. In this area, you had this really interesting mix of cultures. You had Spanish immigrants, French immigrants, African former slaves that came in and brought all these things together. They brought in blues, they brought in, their own cultural music from different places, and they combined it with music of the day, like ragtime. Obviously, many of you have heard of The Entertainer. If you look it up, you can see it, and you've heard it before, which is by Scott Joplin, who was one of the earliest black composers of the day, and it had a huge impact on jazz. So what happened is all these guys and girls from all these different places would get together in these bars and brothels and clubs and things, and they would just play music, and over time it kind of took different aspects and different kinds of music. Early on, it was piano, of course, because pianos were relatively common in places back then. Drums, though the drum sets were much smaller than we think of today. Back then, a lot of times drums were just a hi-hat, bass drum, and snare sometimes. Eventually, they started adding different kinds of cymbals. Ride cymbals were pretty common a little bit early on. Floor toms and different kinds of toms and things, but they were very, very basic. Clarinet was actually a really important instrument early on in jazz history. You had trombone, you had trumpet, and then this is where different areas had slightly different things. For the bass line, some people played tuba, some people played the double bass, like you can see in the picture here. Of course, today now it's mostly double bass, but still in New Orleans you have sousaphone specifically playing a lot of the bass lines. Now, one of the early styles was Dixieland, or New Orleans jazz. One of the big aspects of it was group improvisation. There was a melody, they had an idea of form and chord progressions and things, and then everybody was improvising at the same time. It was a very lively, a very upbeat style of jazz. Very collective, very oral based. Not much of this was written down, obviously, because it was mostly improvised, right? It was just songs that you knew. And they played for all sorts of different events. You had parades, and you had births and funerals and things. These were all events that had jazz in them, that was built into the culture. Some of the early important jazz musicians, obviously I mentioned Scott Joplin earlier, King Oliver, who would go on to teach Louis Armstrong, who was incredibly important in early jazz, but he was a little bit later and kind of led the way into what would become swing. So I didn't include him here. Jelly Roll Morton, who was a piano player, James P. Johnson, Bix Beiderbecke, who was actually a white musician, one of the few famous white jazz musicians, who was a trumpet player. Unfortunately, with a lot of these people and a lot of jazz musicians, honestly, even up to today, a lot of them died very young, 30s, 40s. I think Bix Beiderbecke died in his 20s, because with playing in bars and clubs and brothels and things came a lot of alcohol, came a lot of drugs, a lot of unhealthy eating and lifestyles, staying up really, really late, lots of diseases and things like that. So that was a really big issue in early jazz. A lot of people died really young. Later on, John Coltrane would die young as well. A lot of people. So this is just a little bit of a taste of kind of the roots of jazz, the earliest examples of jazz. An entire class could be taught on this subject, and there are actual classes at university where it's just jazz history, and you could talk about a million different musicians and a bunch of different kinds of jazz, and as jazz moved up to Chicago and New York and all the different variations and things like that. But this is just a very, very bare kind of intro to it. So please make sure you've taken notes on this, and then go and take the quiz that's in Blend. Now, the quiz is just on things that are written on the PowerPoint. There's not going to be anything extra, though it would still be a good idea to have the extra stuff written down, because it's going to be good for you later on, as I mentioned earlier. So thank you for listening. Please do the quiz.